The snow had not stopped for 3 days. It came in sideways across the Wyoming flats, piling against the fence posts until the posts themselves disappeared, turning the yard between the farmhouse and the stable into a field of white that gave no sign of what lay beneath. Eliza Crane had learned, in the 2 years since her husband passed, that a Wyoming winter did not care about your plans. It simply arrived and asked what you were made of. She had gone out to check on the mare at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the light was already going gray and thin. She carried a lantern in her left hand and a feed pail in her right, and the wind took her breath the moment she stepped off the porch. She put her head down and walked. She almost did not see him. He was in the far corner of the stable, pressed between the old grain chest and the wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around himself. A man, she could tell that much. Young, or youngish. His coat was soaked through. His lips had gone a color that frightened her, and when the lantern light reached his face, he flinched and turned away, like a man who had learned that being found was never good news. She set the feed pail down. He looked at her then, and she saw his eyes. Brown, steady, in spite of everything, a steadiness that cost him something to maintain. His voice barely carried over the wind coming through the stable boards. "Do not tell them I can read." She stood very still. The mare shifted in her stall. The lantern swung. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she picked up the feed pail, crossed to the mare, and poured the grain into the trough with her back to him. "Come inside, before you die on my floor and I have to explain it to the sheriff." She did not look back to see if he followed. But she heard him rise. His name was Thomas Aldred, and he told her this only after she had set a pot of soup on the stove and pressed a wool blanket into his hands. He sat at the kitchen table and shook in small, controlled increments, as though ashamed of even that much. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years less. His face was angular and brown from the weather, and his hands, when they wrapped around the mug she gave him, were calloused in the way of a man who had worked outdoors all his life. He had been walking for 2 days. He had come down from the Kendall outfit, which was a sheep and cattle operation about 14 miles north, and he had been let go without his full wages. Let go. She repeated it quietly, more to herself than to him. He looked at the table. "The word for it is that I was let go. The word another man might use is that I was run off with a rifle." She did not ask him which word was truer. She could guess. He ate the soup slowly, with care, as though he understood it was a gift and did not want to waste a drop. She watched him without staring. There was a quality to him she had not expected, a quietness that was not emptiness. He was paying attention to everything. The room, the stove. Her hands when she moved. In the morning, she thought she would sort out what was to be done. Tonight there was only the cold and the soup and the question she had not yet asked him. She asked it near midnight, when the fire had settled to coals and the storm had not let up. "Why did you say that?" "About the reading." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and careful, because Kendall knew. And Kendall did not like it. A man like me, knowing things. Having ideas about what is fair. He said men like me who can read start thinking they are owed something. She looked at him across the table. "And are you owed something?" He met her eyes. "I am owed my wages for 6 weeks of work. That is all I am asking for." She nodded once. She showed him where the spare blankets were stored and where he could sleep, which was the room off the kitchen that had been her hired man Grady Pell before Grady had gone south for his health 3 autumns ago. She would think about what came next, and she would tell him in the morning. She went to bed and lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about a man who had hidden his reading like a wound. The storm broke on the fourth day, and by then it had become clear, without anything being formally said, that Thomas Aldred was not leaving yet. There was too much to do. The drifts against the stable wall were shoulder high, and the horses needed digging out, and the fence on the east side of the property had come down in 2 places. He worked without being asked. She would look up from her own task and find him already at the next one. He moved through the yard with economy and purpose, and he did not complain once. And he did not ask for anything. She watched him fix the east fence on the second clear morning, working with her tools as though he had used them before, which she suspected he had. He did it correctly, which was not nothing. Her father had built that fence, and she was particular about it. She brought him coffee in a tin cup, and he accepted it with both hands. "You have done fence work before." "Some." She waited. "Most things. I learned quickly." She believed him. She was not sure why, except that it matched everything she had seen of him in 4 days. He did not overclaim, and he did not underclaim. He said what was true. That evening she told him she would pay him fair wages if he stayed through the winter. She needed the help, and she could afford it, barely, and there was no shame in the arrangement for either of them. She said this plainly, without apology. He looked at the fire for a moment. "I would like that. There is one condition." He waited. "Do not hide what you know in this house. If you can read, then read. There are books on the shelf in the front room. Help yourself to them." He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. "That is a generous condition. It is not generosity. It is what is fair." Her name was Eliza Crane, born Eliza Marsh in 1854 in Ohio, came west with her husband Daniel at 22, widowed at 26. She had stayed because she did not know what she was going back to, and because the land had become hers in a way she could not explain to anyone who had not stood on it in all its seasons. She was not a woman who spoke easily. She had learned, after Daniel died, that most of what she needed to say she could say with her hands. With bread baked and fences mended and a fire kept through the night. She had grown accustomed to her own company and had told herself she did not miss the other kind. She noticed, slowly and without alarm, that Thomas Aldred was easy to be around. He did not fill the silence with noise. He did not explain himself constantly. He worked, and he was present, and he asked good questions when he had them, and his questions were always about the land or the animals or what she needed done, never about her private grief, which she appreciated. He began reading in the evenings. He sat in the chair near the window with whatever book he had chosen, and he read with the focused attention of a man who has gone a long time without something he needed. She saw him with her father's almanac, with a copy of Dickens that had come west in her trunk, with a thin volume of American geography that had belonged to Daniel. He read all of them. One night she asked him what he was reading, and he showed her. It was a geography book. He had a finger resting on a page about river systems in the Kansas Territory. He had been trying to understand, he told her, why the land up by the Kendall place flooded the way it did in spring. There was something wrong with the way they had run their drainage ditches. The water was sitting where it should have been moving. You noticed that working there. He looked up from the page. You cannot work land without noticing it. She took the book from him and sat down, and they looked at the page together, and she told him what she had seen in the creek bed on the east edge of her own property, and he listened to her the way she had almost forgotten a person could listen, with his whole attention, not waiting for her to finish so he could speak, but taking in what she said. She went to bed that night thinking that Daniel had listened to her that way. She had not met another man who did. His wound was older than the Kendall trouble. She did not learn it all at once. It came in pieces, the way things do when a person has been careful for a long time and is slowly setting that carefulness down. His mother had been a woman who believed in education above nearly everything else. She had taught him herself from what books she could find, and he had been a quick student, and she had been proud of that. He had come west at 17 with her blessing and had worked his way across 3 territories in 13 years, and in nearly every place there had come a moment when someone discovered that he could read and had decided that was an offense. It had cost him work. It had cost him friends. It had cost him more than that. Once, in a mining camp outside of Laramie, where the overseer had taken his books and burned them in front of the other men. He told her this on a Sunday afternoon in February while they were mending a piece of harness together. He told it without drama, in the same even voice he used for everything. But she saw what it had taken from him. She saw it in the way he stopped, briefly, and looked at the far wall. "Your mother taught you well." He turned the leather in his hands before he answered. "She taught me to believe it was worth something. The knowing. I have not always been sure she was right." Eliza thought about that for a moment. "It is worth something. It is worth this much at least. You looked at that geography book and you understood something about drainage that those men at the Kendall place have not figured out in 20 years. He looked at her. "Worth is not what other men decide to allow. You know that." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the harness and went on working. But something had shifted. She could feel it. Raymond Kendall came to her property on the 15th of March. She saw him from the window. He rode a good horse, which he always did, and he brought 2 men with him, which he often did when he thought the conversation might require witnesses or wait. He was 50 and thick through the shoulders, and he had the look of a man who had never been told no by anyone he respected. She came out onto the porch before he could knock. "I hear you have taken on a hired man." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "I have." He looked past her toward the stable, where Thomas was visible through the open doors, working with his back to them. "That man there worked for me. He was let go for cause." "What cause?" Kendall settled in his saddle. "That is a matter between me and him." "Then it is not a matter for my porch." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalculating what kind of trouble this was going to be. "He is owed nothing. I want you to understand that. He made trouble on my property, and I settled it, and he is owed nothing. He told me he is owed 6 weeks' wages." Kendall leaned forward slightly. "He told you wrong." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Kendall, I have lived on this land for 8 years, and I have known you for 7 of them, and I have watched you settle more than one dispute in your favor by being the largest man in the room. That does not make you right. It makes you large." One of his men shifted in the saddle. Kendall himself went very still. "That man is trouble. I am telling you that as a neighbor." She folded her hands in front of her. "I appreciate the warning. Good afternoon." She went inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it, her heart going faster than she would have liked, listening to the sound of hooves in the yard until they faded. Thomas came in a few minutes later. He had seen from the stable. She could tell from the look on his face that he understood who it had been. "He says you are owed nothing." Thomas set down the tool he was carrying. He would say that. I know what he would say. "I am telling you what I believe." He waited. "I believe you are owed 6 weeks' wages, and I believe you did not do whatever it is he claims. And I believe he ran you off because you made him feel small in some way that he decided was your fault." Thomas looked at her for a long time. "You do not know me well enough to be that certain." She met his eyes without blinking. "I know you well enough." Outside, the last of the winter snow was melting off the porch railing in slow, steady drops. and the light was the particular pale gold of a Wyoming afternoon in early spring, when the worst of it is finally, cautiously over. The matter of the wages did not resolve itself quietly, because Raymond Kendall was not a man who let things resolve themselves quietly when he was on the losing side of them. He went to the county land office and filed a complaint against Thomas, claiming damage to his property. It was the kind of thing a man with connections could do when he wanted to make trouble official. The deputy who came out to Eliza's property 3 days later was apologetic about it, in the way of a man who knows he is being used as a tool but has not figured out how to stop. The deputy was named Harlan Voss, and he had known Eliza since before Daniel died, and he sat at her kitchen table and looked uncomfortable and explained that Thomas would need to appear at the county office in Carlton by the end of the month to answer the complaint. Thomas said he would be there. After Voss left, he sat quietly for a while. Then he got up and went to the shelf in the front room and came back with a piece of paper and a pencil, and he sat at the table and began to write. She watched him. He wrote for an hour. She went about her own work, but she watched, and she saw how he wrote, which was precisely and without much crossing out. He knew what he wanted to say, and he set it down. When he was done, he handed her the pages. It was an accounting. Every day he had worked for Kendall, what task, how many hours, what the agreed daily wage had been. He had dates. He had specific numbers. He had the names of 3 other men who had been present when certain wages were discussed. She read it through twice. You kept all of this in your head. His answer was simple. I did not have paper. I kept it in my head. She set the pages down carefully. Thomas, this is going to work. It might. She looked at him. It is going to work. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was something in that moment that was not about the document at all, that was about the months she had not been afraid of the winter, and he had not hidden what he knew, and the way they had moved through the same days with the same purpose without ever having agreed to. She looked away first, because she was not yet ready for what the alternative was. They went to Carlton on the 22nd of March. She drove the wagon. He sat beside her and did not say much, which was his way when he was thinking. The county office was a low building at the end of the main street, and when they came in there were already 4 people waiting, and Kendall was one of them, standing with his hands in his coat pockets and a look of mild surprise at seeing Eliza there at all. The county administrator was a man named Ferris, who was small and precise and clearly preferred paperwork to conflict. Kendall spoke first. He had a prepared statement of his own. It was general and confident in the way of a man who has done this before, who has presented a version of events so many times that he has half convinced himself it is the truth. When Ferris asked Thomas to respond, Thomas laid his written accounting on the desk. 6 weeks of daily labor at the agreed rate. I have the specific dates, the tasks performed, and the witnesses present when the arrangement was confirmed. I am asking for nothing that was not promised. Ferris read the document slowly. He looked up at Kendall. Mr. Kendall, do you dispute the dates or the figures? I dispute the whole of it. Ferris looked back at the pages. These are very specific figures. The names listed. The dates. Are you saying these are invented? Kendall straightened. I am saying that man is unreliable. Ferris set the document down with the measured care of a man who has made his decision. That is not the same as saying the figures are wrong. There was a long silence. Eliza sat very still. She did not look at Kendall. She looked at Thomas, who was looking at Ferris with the same steadiness she had first seen in her stable in January, in the dark, half-frozen, with everything to lose. I am going to recommend settlement of the full wages owed. Mr. Kendall, you may contest this with the circuit judge if you choose. That will take 4 months, and I suspect the result will be the same. Kendall was quiet for a very long moment. Then he took out his billfold. He counted out the money on the desk with the controlled fury of a man who is paying not because he believes he should, but because he has realized that not paying will cost him more. Thomas picked it up. He did not count it in front of Kendall. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He thanked Ferris by name. He walked out. Eliza followed him into the street and the cold air and the ordinary sounds of a March afternoon in Carlton. He stood on the boardwalk with his hands at his sides and took a slow breath. She stood next to him. After a moment, she spoke. "You were right to keep it all in your head." He looked at the mud in the street. "I was afraid, all those years, that it was the wrong thing. Keeping it. Being the kind of man who keeps it. There is no wrong kind to that." He turned and looked at her. The light was flat and bright, and there was mud on the street from the thaw, and it was one of the most ordinary settings she could imagine. And standing in it, she felt something she had told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that she was done feeling. "Eliza, I know. I want to ask you something. I know that too." He studied her face. "Is that an answer?" She looked at him. She was 30 years old. She had buried a husband and managed land alone through 4 winters, and she had made herself into a woman who did not need to be rescued by anyone. She had been proud of that. She was still proud of it. It is the beginning of one. Come home and we will finish it. He looked at her for another moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had not seen before. Quiet and unguarded and real. They walked back to the wagon together. April came warm that year. Thomas stayed. There was no formal conversation about it because none was needed. He was there, and the land required the two of them, and the days found their shape around that fact. She gave him the front room as his proper quarters, since it was larger and had the window seat where he liked to read in the morning light. She kept the back bedroom. The arrangement was practical, and it was also, she knew, temporary, but she was not ready to say so aloud, and neither was he, and there was something right about letting the season itself be the authority on timing. He found more books. She did not ask where, only that he was welcomed at the Carlton Lending Library by the woman who ran it, a Mrs. Eva Porter, who had apparently been waiting 20 years for someone who would read everything she had. He brought home books about soil and water management, about breeds of cattle, about the history of the territory. He read them the way he did everything, carefully, with full attention, putting them down only when the work required it. She borrowed 2 herself. On a Saturday in early May, she came out to the porch with coffee and found him sitting on the top step with the geography book open on his knee, the same book they had looked at together in February. He had a pencil in his hand and was making small marks in the margins. She sat down beside him. She looked at what he had drawn. He had sketched a revised drainage plan for the East Field, labeling the water channels, the grade, the outlet point. It was precise, and it was, she could see immediately, correct, if they did what he was suggesting. The field that had been waterlogged every spring since she had owned it would drain properly for the first time. This would work. He looked over the drawing. "I believe so. I can dig it myself if you want to try it. We will dig it together." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she had learned to recognize over the months as what happened when he received something he had not expected and was not yet practiced at accepting. She took the geography book from his hands and turned to the page about the Kansas River systems. She had a question she had been saving for the right moment. They sat on the porch in the May morning and talked about water and land, and it was entirely ordinary, and it was everything, and the sun came up higher, and the mud in the yard dried to warm earth, and the season turned on its hinge without asking anyone's permission. They dug the drainage channel the following week, working from the low corner of the east field toward the creek bed, following the grade Thomas had mapped in his penciled margins. The work was slow and wet. The ground was still cold a foot down, and the spade rang against stones in the lower section, and they had to dig around them, which added time neither of them had counted on. She did not mind. There was something settled about working alongside someone who planned before he lifted a tool, who stopped to look and to think before committing the ground to a direction that could not be easily undone. Daniel had worked that way too, measured and deliberate, and she had loved that about him. She had thought, after he was gone, that she would not find that quality in another person. Thomas did not speak much while he worked. Neither did she. They moved around each other in the field with the ease of two people who have learned each other's pace, who know when to give ground and when to hold a line. By the fourth afternoon, the channel ran clean from the low corner all the way to the creek outlet, and the water that had sat pooled in that corner every spring since she arrived was moving. She stood at the high end and watched it go. He came up beside her and looked at the same thing. They stood there for a while without speaking. Then he drove his spade into the earth and rested both hands on the handle. "Your father built a good fence," he said at last, meaning the one on the east edge, the one he had repaired in January. He had thought about it, she could tell, off and on since that first week. It was the way he paid attention to things, slowly, thoroughly, circling back. She looked at the moving water. He did. He was a careful man. Thomas nodded once, that particular kind of careful. He meant it as a compliment, and she understood it as one. They walked back to the house in the last of the afternoon light with the tools over their shoulders and the sound of the creek coming up through the willows, fuller now, the way it was supposed to be. On a Sunday in June, Thomas Aldred built a bookshelf. He built it in the front room, against the wall that caught the morning light. He used wood from a downed fence post and the tools she kept in the stable, and he worked through the afternoon while she was in the kitchen with her bread. When she came out to call him for supper, the shelf was up and level, and he had already begun arranging the books on it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. He set the last book in place before he turned. "If you object to the placement, I can move it. I do not object." She came in and stood next to him and looked at the books on the shelf. Her father's almanac, the Dickens, the geography book with his penciled margins, a new volume on cattle breeds he had brought from Carleton. Two she did not recognize. He took one of the unfamiliar ones down and held it out to her. It was a thin book, worn at the spine. He had found it at the lending library, he told her. Mrs. Porter had thought she might like it. A woman who had crossed the territory in 1863 had written about everything she saw. She took it. She turned it in her hands. "I did not know there was such a book. Mrs. Porter says there are several if you want them." She held the book for a moment. Then she looked at the shelf, at the space where it had come from, at the way he had left room for more. "Thomas," he turned. "Yes, I am glad you were in my stable." He was quiet for a moment. The light was long and gold through the front window, and it lay across the shelf and the books and his hands. "I was afraid that night. I want you to know that. I was afraid, and I did not know what you were going to do, and I told you the one true thing I had to offer, which was the thing I had learned to keep hidden, and you went and fed the horse. The horse needed feeding." A quiet sound came from him, something between a breath and a word. "I know. That is what I mean." She understood him. She understood him entirely. She set the book on the shelf. She turned to face him in the long evening light of a Wyoming June, with the bread going warm in the kitchen and the land outside soft and opened up by the drainage channel they had dug together in May. "I have been choosing you since January. I did not say so because I needed to be sure I was choosing freely, and not from need, and I am sure now." He took a breath before he spoke. "I have been choosing you since the stable. I did not say so because I thought you were still deciding. I have decided." He reached out and took her hand. Just that. Quietly, in the room with the new shelf and the old books and the bread smell coming through from the kitchen. Outside, a meadowlark was carrying on somewhere beyond the east fence, singing its one loud, urgent song into the summer air, with no care at all for dignity or restraint. She had come to Wyoming with a man she loved and lost him, and stayed, and built the life herself, and told herself it was enough, because it was what she had. And it had been enough. She had meant that. But this was more than enough. This was being seen by someone who had no reason to look closely, and had looked anyway. Being known by someone who understood the value of what she had built, not because it was impressive, but because he had worked alongside it. In mud and cold and ordinary morning light, and found it good. Thomas Aldred, who had hidden his reading like a secret wound for more years than she cared to think about, stood in her front room with his hand around hers, and the shelf he had built was on the wall with room on it for more, and outside the meadowlark was still singing, and neither of them needed to say anything else at all.